As the title says there, what I'm going to try and help you understand is what this idea of privatization is, and in fact, what it would mean if we continue to go down the road of privatizing public education. So let's start first with thinking about what in fact is public about public education. I talk about public having at least 5 dimensions. You may have others. I'd be really interested in what you would want to add to my list, but at a minimum, we have 5 kinds of publicness that make it public education. It's not simply about funding. One of the terms that you hear, the slogans that you'll hear is a voucher in every backpack. And that seems to suggest that the only aspect of publicness that matters is the money. But I think that the other 4 aspects of publicness are equally, if not more important. So what are those? And I'll go through each one of these. But those 5 are public purpose, public funding, public access, public accountability to communities, and public curriculum. Public purpose. This is the recognition that education is not simply a private endeavor. Certainly, I have an interest in how I'm educated, just myself. I've also had an interest in how my 3 daughters are educated. But I benefit when my neighbor's children are educated. I benefit even if I have no children, because we all benefit from an educated citizenry. And in fact, that educated citizenry is an essential component of democracy if in fact democracy is going to work. It's also part of what we commonly call the commons, like a police department or a fire department is part of what we do for and with each other. In fact, it's so important that we invest in education together through public funding, and it's so important that it's in the state constitution. The state constitution guarantees it and directs the legislature to fund it. This is not a discretionary activity for the legislature. It's a constitutional obligation that they fund public education. And in fact, it appears in all 50 state constitutions, including our own. And I'll show you what our state constitutional provision actually says a little later. Next is public access. A public school serves the entire public, not just portions of it. So all of the people of the public, as diverse as we are welcome at a public school. That's true regardless of race, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of language spoken in the home, regardless of sex, disability, sexual orientation, religion. You can keep going all the way down those various characteristics. The public school serves everybody. And in fact, that constitutional provision I mentioned earlier creates a fundamental constitutional right to an education at the state level. That fundamental is an important word in legalese. It means it raises up, if you will, the scrutiny that we look at when we look at whether or not that, in fact, right is in existence or has been taken away. And finally, this public access, the idea that a public school serves everybody, all portions of the public, creates a common school experience so that we learn with and from people who do not think the same way we do, who in fact come from different backgrounds, different cultures, different ideas, so that, as my grandmother said, you can learn to disagree without being disagreeable. And then there's public accountability to communities. It was inspiring to see so many of you stand as elected officials, either for school boards or for communities or for the county. And that's how we take care of each other through this elected democracy that we have. We elect our neighbors. Those neighbors are tasked with holding our schools and those who work in them accountable through the policies that they adopt. And of course, that's at the local level, the state level, and the federal level. And of course, if at any one of those levels a policy is adopted with which we disagree, we have the ability to use our vote to vote in new neighbors and hold those folks accountable through our vote. One thing I'll mention, and you're going to hear me say later, that some of the proposals here are going to diminish or reduce local control of public education. That's important. And one thing I want to point out to you is whenever you hear that local control is reduced, that means your vote has been taken away in part. curriculum, we decide together what it means to be educated, and we decide collectively what is to be taught, the standards that we're going to teach to, and how we're going to measure the learning to those standards. And of course, over time, we change that curriculum, we change the standards. When I went to high school, there wasn't such a thing called computer literacy, but of course we wouldn't consider kids educated today if in fact they weren't computer literate. That's just a simple example. So that's what's public about public education. What in fact then is privatization? When you hear that term, what are they talking about? You see a number of issues listed out there, but in general, what we're talking about is that when we're taking public funds and we're directing them to private purposes, and in particular when we're letting private groups or individuals direct how tax dollars are in fact spent. In education, we generally talk about three kinds of privatization. The biggest privatization is a voucher plan. That's the use of public tax dollars for tuition at a private school, a privately operated school. Then there are tax credit plans, also sometimes called neo-vouchers. And then charter schools, particularly when those charter schools are authorized by some kind of entity other than a school board. In other words, they could be authorized by a university or somebody else, but not an elected body. And particularly when those charter schools are then operated by for-profit charter management organizations. We have lots and lots and lots of school choice in Wisconsin, and there you see a list, and I won't go in the interest of time through all of them, but you see a list of all the various forms of public school choice in the state of Wisconsin. We also have private school choice in the state of Wisconsin. In fact, we were the first state in the United States to have private school choice, publicly funded dollars paying for private school tuition. That started in 1990 with the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program. In 2011, we added the Racine Parental Choice Program, and in 2013, the Wisconsin Parental Choice Program, or the statewide program which would affect you here. In addition, we have the tuition tax deduction, which was also adopted in 2013, although I'm not really going to speak about that this evening. In terms of those dimensions of publicness that I talked about, as this chart is attempting to demonstrate, in each instance, as we move toward privatization, whether we're moving all the way to vouchers, public money in private schools, or we're looking at charters, particularly those independent charters that are not chartered by or authorized or overseen by school boards, we reduce, in fact, each of those dimensions of publicness. We are, in fact, giving publicness away. And that's something I think we need to think about, and think about mindfully. Are we really ready to allow private purposes to supersede public purposes in a situation? Because that's what happens in a private voucher program. Are we really ready to have public access diminish so that some schools teach some kids and some schools teach other kids, but they don't have to teach everybody? Is that okay with us? Is it okay that public tax dollars are spent in schools where you as a voter or a community has no say in what happens in that school, perhaps even no say that that school exists at all in the case of an independent charter? And finally, in terms of public curriculum, are we okay with public tax dollars being spent in schools where we have no say in what is being taught or how it's being taught? For example, the private schools that participate in the voucher program have to meet the definition of a private school in Wisconsin. Private schools in Wisconsin have to have 875 hours of instruction. That's at least 125 fewer hours that public schools have to provide. And private schools have to promise to teach reading, language arts, science, mathematics, and health. But that's it. And that's not the list that public schools have to abide by. And of course, within that, they're free to focus on whatever aspects or use whatever curriculum they want, whether it relates to what happens in the public schools or what we've adopted as state standards for public schools is not germane. So in order to think about privatization, I think it's helpful to look at what's going on in Milwaukee. If you want to see what's going to happen statewide, we have an example in Milwaukee. What happened may happen with a statewide program. These lists, as you see here, are the characteristics of the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program when it was first enacted in 1990. When it was first enacted, it only permitted 1%, or approximately 1,000 of the enrolled children in Milwaukee Public Schools to participate. The schools had to be located within the city limits, and they had to be non-sectarian or non-religious. The family income was 175% of the federal poverty level. And by the way, families had to be eligible every year, demonstrate eligibility every year. The participating schools could enroll no more than 49% of their overall student population by means of a voucher. In other words, the schools had to remain more private than public. And the voucher was about $2,500 per student. Now, we have gotten rid of all of those limitations. There are no limitations on the kinds of schools, no limitations on where the schools are located, no limitation on how many students a school can enroll by means of a voucher. Eligibility is now 300% of the federal poverty level, which, by the way, is more than the median income for a family in Wisconsin. You only have to demonstrate eligibility the first year that you're eligible. If your family income increases after that, the child remains eligible for a voucher until they graduate from high school. And the voucher amount is now $7,210 for an elementary student, $7,856 for a high school student. How many are participating? We now have 113 participating private schools, about 27,000 students. If the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program were a school district, it would be the third largest in the state. We spent this year, this school year alone, $191 million on this program. It's funded in a complex formula that I won't go into, but it's partly by taking state aids away from Milwaukee Public Schools and partly from general purpose revenues. The average Milwaukee Parental Choice Program enrolls 82% of their students by means of a voucher. Think about that for a minute. 82% of the students, on average, is publicly funded, not privately funded. And in fact, 18 schools have only voucher enrollment, and another 50 have between 90 and 99.9% voucher enrollment. So 68 out of the 113 schools have between 90 and 100% voucher enrollment, which has caused at least one group to describe these schools as private in name only. This shows you that if we were talking about those original parameters, you would see that only less than 10 of the schools meet that requirement that the schools be more private than public. If we look at Racine's program, Racine's program has the same eligibility requirements as the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, so 300% of the poverty level, but remember that's just for the first year. The family's income goes up, the child can remain in the program. Same voucher amounts, 15 participating schools, about 1,700 students, cost the state $12.5 million. The statewide program, its eligibility is a little stricter, 185% of the federal poverty level, currently limited by statute to 1,000 students. Why it's 1,013 is because, you know, the little ones who aren't in school all day get counted half of it. So that's why that's a little more than 1,000. No more than 1% of any school district. Does that number sound familiar? We've talked about Milwaukee. Same voucher amounts, cost the state not quite $7.5 million. And the majority of the students who participate in this program never attended public school, but in fact attended private school previously. In other words, they just shifted who paid the bill. Before, some private entity, the parents or a scholarship foundation, paid for tuition. Now public tax dollars do. This is data from DPI that was just released about a week ago. It shows who applied to the program for next year. You can see there that nearly 80% were already in private schools. Notice that only 526 students applied who were previously who are currently public school students. There are than 1% of the students applying. So this idea that people are just clamoring to get out of public schools is easily debunked by this chart. The grand total of what we spent this year on these 3 voucher programs is nearly $211 million, and that's at the same time that the Wisconsin Budget Project, when they analyzed what we spent and did an inflation adjustment, shows that we are spending 15.3% less on public education than we spent in 2008. These were the proposals that were in the Governor Walker's bill. I'm actually not going to talk about them because they've kind of faded away. At 1:30 in the morning on May 20th, the Joint Finance Committee adopted an omnibus motion that has a whole lot of education policy in it. This is what it looks like. Without any opportunity for you to weigh in or me to weigh in or anybody to weigh in. It happened from around 8 o'clock at night until 1:30 in the morning. Here's what they did. Revenue limits, and I'll explain those, are maintained. There's no increase or decrease in the special aid payment for next year. An additional $100 per student for the year thereafter. They expand the voucher program, eventually removing all caps in 10 years. They also added some things that were not in the governor's bill at all, expanding 2-hour charters with more authorizers. The governor wanted to do that in a slightly different way. Creating a special education voucher program, which, by the way, is not supported by any disability advocacy group in the state. And in fact, when it has been introduced in the past as a standalone bill, has been defeated. And the plan to take over Milwaukee Public Schools. So let's talk about each one of those things that the Joint Finance Committee passed at 1:30 in the morning on a 12-4 party line vote. To understand, you need to understand how school finance works. We have an incredibly complicated finance formula in the state of Wisconsin, but I'm going to give you, as it says there, a primer. And so it doesn't have everything in it, but it'll give you the flavor. The first thing to understand is this idea of revenue limits. Revenue limits create a fixed amount of funds available per pupil. We adopted this in 1994. It's like creating a box. That box is frozen and that box can't get bigger, as I'll explain in a minute. Into that box, 2 sources of funds are included. One is state aid and the other is local property taxes. We have formulas meant to equalize funding across districts, recognizing that for a district that is property rich, they can tax themselves at a low rate but still generate a lot of money, so they are reliant predominantly on local taxes with a little bit of state aid, and vice versa. If it's a property poor district, because they can tax themselves at a high rate but still not generate a lot of money, they get more state aid. Now, in a bounded system, right, with 2 parts, if one part gets bigger, the other part gets smaller. Which means that if the legislature holds revenue caps constant or holds revenue limits constant, it doesn't matter how much money they say they're putting into the system, not one more penny can be spent on a student in a public school. It merely results in tax savings. So if they pour more red money, if you will, it just lowers the blue money that school districts are permitted to collect. It doesn't permit the school districts to spend more money unless they get a bigger box. The only way they can spend more money on kids is if those revenue limits are in fact increased. The only way to get that box bigger, to have revenue limits increased, is either for the state legislature to do it by statute, they give us a bigger box, or you go to referendum and ask the voters in your community to give you a bigger box. If you noticed in April that a lot of school districts seem to be having referenda, this is why. Because the state has not given us a bigger box in quite some time, and so school districts trying to keep pace with inflation are forced to go to referendum to get more money. Here's a graphic that I adapted from the Wisconsin Taxpayers Alliance that shows what is being planned for the next biennium in what was passed by the Joint Finance Committee. In the first year of the biennium, there would be no change, not a penny different. it would be the same. In the next biennium, there would be a $100 increase for each school district. But notice that, if you will, in this graphic, it's orange money. That means it's outside of the equalization formula. It's something else, which, frankly, over time will have a disequalizing effect, right? And they're doing this while keeping revenue limits constant, which means that for the most state aid, we're still back into that. The only way to get a bigger box is to go to voters and referendum. Revenue limits are held constant. The Wisconsin Budget Project puts it this way. You probably read in your paper that there are $208 million more being spent on K-12 education. That's really misleading because, in fact, more than half of it is simply in property tax relief and is not on any money that gets to go to schools for being spent on students. You see that another chunk is expanding vouchers and charters, and then we have a little bit that is being spent in schools, but as I'll show you in a minute, that money gets sucked out to go pay for vouchers and charters anyway. So looking at that expansion of the voucher program, first let's look at participation. So this is the statewide program. For the next 2 years, next 2 school years, it would be limiting to 1% of any school district's enrollment. So I looked up Mineral Point's enrollment. You have about 750 kids, so that's 7 students. Maybe 8, depending on whether they count a half student or not, I don't know. Then every year thereafter, it will bump up by 1% until it hits 10%, and then the year after that, there will be no limit. The Legislative Fiscal Bureau estimates that in the next 2 years, an additional 3,000 children will be funded through vouchers in the state of Wisconsin. For funding this, the districts can count the children for state aid purposes, but the money goes directly to the voucher, so it's kind of a pass-through. The same amounts are guaranteed. As a comparison I showed you in terms of statewide open enrollment, if a child moves across district lines through statewide open enrollment, the amount of money is $6,635, but it's $7,210 and $7,856 for vouchers. The Legislative Fiscal Bureau estimates it'll cost $37.1 million. In another paper, they estimate $48 million, so it's somewhere between those two. I use the lower number here, so it's somewhere between $37 and $48 million. And over the next decade, the Legislative Fiscal Bureau estimates it will cost the state between $600 and $800 million, depending on participation, to expand the existing program. In addition, last Friday night, in an omnibus bill about universities, talked as the last provision, is a provision to create more independent or 2-hour charters. Right now, the only independent 2-hour charters exist in Milwaukee and then one in Racine. They're independent because the school board has no authority over them. In Milwaukee, there are 3 special chartering authorities: Milwaukee Area Technical College, which has never exercised its authority, the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, which has, and the Common Council of the City of Milwaukee, which has. And then in addition, the University of Wisconsin-Parkside can charter one and only one school. Those schools get $8,075 per student, and in fact, your superintendent can show you on his budget the line that your tax dollars are going to support those schools right now. The proposal from the Joint Finance Committee would add 4 new special authorizers. First of all, the Board of Regents would have to create an Office of Educational Opportunity and hire a commissioner. That person would be that office would be permitted to charter schools in any district with more than 25,000 students. That's only Milwaukee and Madison, if you're curious. But they can do that without any input from the voters or the school board in either of those communities. The county executive of Waukesha can charter schools in Waukesha County. Tribal colleges and Gateway Technical College can charter schools in the home or adjacent counties. And in fact, DPI has listed in a recent news release that that will affect 177 school districts in some way or another. And in fact, the potential to affect any school district through statewide open enrollment. So for example, if a charter school was created by the child in that school, if they were willing to take them there, or if it was a virtual school, by enrolling them that way. The funding is reducing the school's aid payment. I'll explain how that works in just a second. And it's prohibited for the school, your school board, to adjust the tax levy to fill in the hole that that money leaving the school district would create. They also created a special education voucher program. You heard Jeff mention that I studied both school choice and special education, so I can tell you that this would make us the 11th state in the country to have some sort of special education voucher. Ours is fairly limited. You see the eligibility there in the middle, but there are no income limits, and there are no limits on the number of kids who can participate in this. So that 1% that we talked about before doesn't apply to this form of voucher at all. And there are no income limits. By the way, there's already provision in federal law to allow for tuition reimbursement if, in fact, the school district is denying an appropriate education for a child. This program would not require the private schools taking the $12,000 to have any special education expertise or even to deliver any special education as long as the parents permitted it. It would just have a $12,000 voucher going to that school. This is done at a time where you can see that over the last decade, the state has continually reduced the amount of money it sends to public schools and categorical aids for special education. As you see there, in 2001, it was 36%. We are now down to 26%, and this would be the 8th year of flat funding, or 9 years for this one, for the last 10 years. And thank you to DPI for this particular record. So putting this all together, I wanted to give you 2 examples. So first I'll give you Madison's example. Madison is our 2nd largest school district, 27,000 students. It gets a little more than $1,900 per student in general equalization or general state aid, and then categorical aids in another $1,111, for a total of $3,072. So that means then, if they have a 2-hour charter school, they would have to use those general and equalization form monies. And by the way, those categorical aids are for categories of need: special education, English language learners, some transportation aid, class size reduction aid. In other words, they're categories to be used for that particular categorical purpose. But this would siphon or what word do I want to be? Divert, thank you, that money over to another purpose. And in fact, so you can see that they would have to use that money. They still wouldn't have enough, so they would end up using local tax dollars to make up the difference. And you can see that that rolls up. If you want to think about just the next school year, if in fact they had a full 1% of their students, and here I use the elementary voucher amount only. Remember, the 2-hour charters, there's no limit. Special ed voucher, there's no limit. But for at least the statewide voucher, there is a 1% limit. I used the lower of the 2 amounts. So if they had a full 274 students exercise vouchers in Madison, that would cost Madison School District, they would have nearly a $2 million hole that they would have to fill. And in fact, 304,000 of it would be taking categorical aids and diverting them to a purpose for which it was never intended. It was intended for the categorical purpose, now it would be used to fund vouchers. And another $1 million would be borne by local property taxes. And remember that the majority of kids that participate in this program, at least to date, have never attended public schools. How about Mineral Point? Mineral Point has 750 students. Your equalization or general state aid per student is about $6,500. Categorical aid 708 for a total of 7,218. For a 2-hour charter, you'd have about $857 to make up in local property taxes. For an elementary voucher, you'd be able to cover it. And you wouldn't have to use local tax dollars, but you would be moving those categorical aids to another purpose. The high school voucher, you'd have to kick in some local funds, and the special ed voucher, you'd have to kick in a whole lot more local funds. If we looked at that same thing, and again using elementary, because of how that works, you can see have a $50,000 hole, and $4,900 of your categorical aids would be diverted to a new purpose. If we look at the next school year, now it goes up, 2 school years away, it goes up to 2%, and here I use, just for grins, the high school amount of the voucher, and you can see those numbers. And of course, every year, that would increase and get bigger. Another provision that was approved by the Joint Finance Committee is a takeover of Milwaukee Public Schools. It actually is written such that anybody in Milwaukee County or has more than 15,000 students, and then some parameters kick in. The upshot is that when this happens, the governance is taken away from the school board and given away. It is given, in fact, to either an independent charter school or a private non-sectarian choice school. So think about that. We're going to give the governance of a local public school to a private school operator. Or, as the measure says here, an individual or group not currently operating a school. I don't know what that means or why they should take over a school, but there you go. Provisions, as it says, would also apply to other schools at certain times, given what we know about those schools. West Allis, Madison, and Green Bay would be the most likely 3 school districts that would next be hit by this takeover. It means that in the city of Milwaukee, there would be 4 kinds of public funding for schools. So, of course, the original one was the Milwaukee Public Schools, which is governed by a democratically elected school board. Given concerns about how well students were doing, in 1990 we decided to try that experiment called voucher schools. Now, to be fair, this was the first time it had tried. We had no empirical evidence about the issue, and so they wanted to give it a shot. We now do have empirical evidence, and I'll share in a minute. That didn't work. So in 1997, we added independent to our charter schools. That didn't work. So now in 2015, we want to add this other kind. Only one of the 4, though, would be controlled by democratically elected school boards. Only one of the 4 would be influenced by any voter in the city of Milwaukee. What we have learned over that period of time is that although it sounds seductive and we wish it did work, simply changing governance structures is not going to make schools better. And in fact, it ignores the real problem, which is the educational effects of high poverty and student mobility, which I know Jeff is going to share more about in a little bit. Other educational policies in the JVC bill, and I don't even have all of them listed here, but first, statewide open enrollment would be amended to permit more access for children with disabilities and would also result in a $12,000 fund transfer when a child makes that shift. And by the way, special education is very broad, right? So we have some kids receiving maybe 30 minutes of speech and language therapy once a week under an IEP. And then we have other kids, because of their needs, who are receiving a lot more services, maybe the services of a special educator, maybe occupational therapy, speech and language therapy, physical therapy, and you can kind of go down the list, right? So some kids actually cost perhaps more than $12,000 and some way less, but it wouldn't matter, the $12,000 goes, period. Public schools would now have to permit private school, homeschool, and charter school students to participate in all sports and extracurricular activities to the same extent that your enrolled students do. Teachers could be licensed without adequate training, and for some licenses, no college, or I should say, as it's currently written, no high school diploma would even be required. Now keep in mind, the school districts that are likely to be tempted by this flexibility, if you will, are not going to be your wealthy school districts. It would create a new civics test requirement for kids who are currently in 10th grade. That's my youngest daughter. She's real happy about this one. And then onward, 100 question test, and they would have to score 60% on it, or they couldn't graduate. And it would permit students to earn high school credits through portfolio submission. I can't explain that further because it's not explained further in the bill, and I don't really know what it means. What are the effects of these budget decisions? For the first time since 1994, we would have revenue caps frozen outlined that on the one chart. Revenue caps would be the same. In other words, our box is frozen from this year and 2 years hence. Think about whether or not you think that's realistic, that for 3 school years, there will be no change in the amount of costs. No change in heating, no change in food. You can go on down the road, right? For the first time ever in the history of the state, Wisconsin will be below the national average for pupil spending on education. By the way, I should mention that teacher licensure change would make us the state with the lowest standards for teacher licensure in the country. So when they listed the states in terms of their teacher licensure standards, we would be number 50 if this in fact is adopted. It would be the 8th consecutive year of no special education increases. By the way, I could have also added increases for teaching kids who need to learn English or bilingual. It continues a pattern of voucher creation and expansion through budget bills, where we don't have the opportunity for our elected officials to vote just on this idea. So keep in mind, this has gone out of the Joint Finance Committee. It now goes, and Representative Roberts can explain this to, Sandy can explain this to you better than I can, but it now goes to the floor, and she's going to get one vote for the entire budget. And she has to vote yay or nay. If she votes nay, so it covers prisons, it covers the DNR, it covers roads, every state agency, it covers all of that with one vote. And no ability to vote yay or nay on any of the proposals that I laid out for you here. And by the way, several of those haven't even had any public hearings on the matter. And you can tell, I think that is a disservice to democracy, just saying. And then finally, they all neglect poverty, and they also make our property poor districts even more vulnerable. In fact, I was listing for a colleague today all of the things in these budget bills that disadvantage school districts that are on the low end of the poverty spectrum. It's not a pretty list. And in fact, when you put that all together, who do we fund? And I think this shows you every budget is an expression of values and priorities. Charter schools actually get the funding first. Voucher kids get the funding second. And those 870,000 public school kids get to divide up what's left after those 2 choice programs are funded. So what does that mean to have a right to an education? Here is our state constitutional provision. The legislature shall provide for a system of district schools nearly as uniform as practicable. In 2000, the Wisconsin Supreme Court, in a case called Vincent versus Boyd, said, and this, by the way, these 2 paragraphs were unanimous. So all 7 justices agreed with these 2 paragraphs, but then it split after that. And so they upheld the funding formula in a 4-3 vote. But these 2 paragraphs they all agreed on. It establishes that the Constitution creates a fundamental right to a sound basic, equal opportunity for a sound basic education. And the legislature has to put enough money in the system for the opportunity for students to be proficient in math, science, reading, writing, geography, and history, and for them to receive instruction in a second set of classes, as you can see. And by the way, those are the ones that private schools, the ones that are underlined in blue, private schools have to attend to those, but not to the others. Moreover, the system has to acknowledge that some kinds of students actually cost more to educate, and so the legislature has to fund sufficient to attend to those special needs. 3 groups of students: students with disabilities, those from economic disadvantage, and students who are learning English. At the time this was litigated in 2000, the year 2000, remember it was a 4-3 vote. Special ed was being funded by the state at 39%, and English language learners was 25%. Now we're down to 26 and 8 respectively. So why privatization? These are the arguments that people often make. Are people, in fact, dissatisfied with public schools? All surveys we have and research we have on that answers that question, no. In fact, they are not. Are public schools failing? No. I can give you a list of books if you'd like. But actually, when you compare apples to apples and you control for who attends schools, our best research tells us that, in fact, public schools outperform private schools and charter schools. How about research on vouchers? Trust me, if having vouchers in Milwaukee for more than 20 years, if this was our silver bullet, if it worked, we would know. And in fact, research tells us that those schools do no better and sometimes worse. And even those research studies that have found small, statistically significant gains, they're usually in one group of students for one subject. So in other words, we're spending $211 million so that 8th graders can answer 3 more questions correct on a math test. Is that worth our investment? How about research in charter schools? Nope. They don't outperform public schools either. And in fact, those charter schools that do the best are those that are operated by school boards. So that leaves us with reasons that are ideological. We want to shrink government, and if we shrink public education, the biggest expense on the state list of expenses, we've shrunken government. And then choice for choice sake. What could be bad about choices? But I would say, can we in fact afford to fund 2 systems of schools, the public system and the private system? And there's a third reason, and that's money. If I had time, I would show you a clip from CNBC where there's a person who's arguing that you should invest in for-profit charter management organizations as a way to grow your bank account. And maybe I'm old-fashioned, but I don't think after we publicly educate kids, there should be money left over for anybody's bank account. I would also ask you to think about what it means as we shift from public accountability to private accountability or parental accountability through a choice system, an increasing choice system. One, it says to all of you who don't have children, go away, we don't care what you think. But it also says to parents, now it's your job. You have to figure out whether or not the program content is of sufficient quality, because all of those guarantees that you have when you walk into a public school aren't there in a private school. You're going to have to figure out whether the program is of sufficient quality. You're going to have to figure out whether the personnel have the right qualifications. And you're accountable for your choices. So if you're not happy with what's happening in your child's school, it won't be to push to make the system better. The response from the system will be, we've given you choices. It's your own fault. Choose better. So some final thoughts. I would argue that the constitutional obligation is paramount. And no matter whether our legislators want to or have a desire to subsidize private choices, it can't be subordinated to that constitutional obligation. Which means then if you read that Constitution, you can have a public system without choice, but you can't have a choice system without public school options that are worth choosing. In other words, you can't starve public ed in order to fund private ed. Because constitutions have created a real right to a substantively quality education. And I would argue, going back to those dimensions of publicness, I'm really bothered by how these things have come to be. Both the original Milwaukee Parental Choice Program and every major expansion since has been buried in a budget bill where our representatives have gotten 1 vote. If it's an idea that is worthy, it should be able to be pulled out quite literally into the light of day and survive the transparency of the democratic process where you get to say it's a great idea or not, and so do your neighbors. And then we see how everybody votes, and I can see whether or not my representative either supported vouchers or didn't, supported independent charters or didn't, supported changing teacher licensure or didn't, not that it was all rolled into one big bill. And with that, I will get off my soapbox.